My name is Chris Baldwin, and I'm one of the students with the Engage program. So before I welcome our next guest, I have a couple of announcements to make. First, so I have a script here, but I don't really need it. The research I do fits into theoretical physics, and it's particularly how to describe emergent properties of systems that are made of many, many interacting particles, and what goes wrong when those pieces don't play well together. And that's clearly a very difficult thing to convey, even to myself often. And the Engage program really has provided a unique service for me in what it's done. This is really the only place where I get some actual practice, some training in how to communicate what this is that I do, because that's a necessary part of research, right? But all the same, it's really never emphasized in the sort of formal courses we take. And because of that, I'm really glad to have been a part of the Engage program. So if you want to learn more about it, I would encourage you to visit the website, engage-science.com. And also, I should also mention that the best way to keep in touch with what's going on at Town Hall is to become a member. So, of the perks that you get down front seated, you get discounts on books and ticket purchases, and you also get a mail copy of Town Hall's monthly calendar. And most importantly, this is how we fund all of these events. There's more than 400 events annually going on here at affordable prices. So having said that, let's say hello to our second guest. Roxanne Carini is a student in the Civil and Environmental Engineering department, and she's going to be sharing her research on breaking waves, the change makers of the coastal environment. So Roxanne is going to be explaining why waves break as they approach the beach, and explore both the sustainable and the destructive consequences of wave breaking. So whether the coast is a place you call home, a place you vacation, or a land far, far away that you know nothing about, this talk is for you. So let's say hello to Roxanne.
You liked that line, didn't you? Okay, thanks for that introduction, Chris, and thank you all for spending some of your Thursday night at Town Hall with us. So yes, I'm going to talk about wave breaking and currents at the beach, and I'd like to set the scene by inviting all of you to close your eyes and listen to the sound of the ocean. And I want you to imagine yourself on your favorite beach. And that could be a deserted cove. It could be a really popular beach spot with lots of people. And maybe you play beach volleyball, or maybe you build a sand castle. And when you eat your lunch, you probably have to hunch over your sandwich so the seagulls don't get to it. Maybe you like to set your chair up in the really hot sand and dig your feet down to the cooler layers. Or you like to stand at the ocean's edge and test the water. When the sun's at its hottest, you run out into the water, splashing, plunging, and eventually you get knocked over by a breaking wave. You get back up, you swim out there, and you get past the breakers, and you let the ocean bob you up and down and up and down. And eventually you decide, okay, I'm ready to go in, so you catch a wave and you body surf it to shore. But that was a lot of fun, so you turn around and you go and catch another one. And then eventually when you've had enough salt water and you've swallowed enough, you head in and enjoy the rest of your day. So you can open your eyes now. Where you just were is called the surf zone, where you were swimming. And this is the region that I study. The surf zone starts wherever the waves start to break offshore and ends at the shoreline. And the surf zone clearly lies at the intersection between land and the ocean. And so it's very important both for society, because as people we like to live on the coasts, and also the environment, everything that's going on there. This coastal region contributes to lots of things. For example, there's subsistence fishing, which feeds local economies, or large-scale tourism feeding national economies. There's many people feel a strong spiritual connection to the sea and often seek out the coastline for that connection. And then others seek it out for recreation, like we just talked about. This is the Olympic Peninsula, in case you're wondering. But the coast is also home to a lot of flora and fauna, and as it is also densely populated by people, it's a place that we have to be careful about resource development and use and resource preservation. So today, for my talk, I'm going to focus on the surf zone, and I'm going to focus on the major change makers in the surf zone, which is breaking waves. And it's also the focus of my PhD research. So while the surf zone has been studied extensively, we still don't have a great understanding, a great characterization of the process of wave breaking. But that process is really important. And wave breaking is really complicated, right? It's sporadic, and it can change rapidly. So this makes it really difficult to measure. On top of that, the world is covered with diverse beaches. I'm sure each of you in that visualization exercise imagined a different beach. And so maybe you imagined a beach that was really good for surfing, or maybe it's known as a good fishing spot. But a lot of our knowledge about the present and past conditions is local knowledge gained through experience. And we now want to know what our future conditions are. And so what scientists use as a tool to predict what future conditions and changes to our coastlines will be are computational models. And what's important for computational models is for them to be guided by observational data that's about a particular beach so that you get accurate results and you can trust your future predictions. So what my research tries to do is, what my research focuses on is measuring breaking waves so that they can be used as guiding factors in the models that scientists use to predict what might happen in the future to our coastlines. Let's take a step back, though, and let's look at some of the important processes that are these change makers in the surf zone. So waves and currents do a lot of things. They can move dye around, and so it might be a little bit tricky for you to see, but this picture was taken several hours after pink dye, a non-harmful pink dye, was released along the coastline. And it has moved along the coastline and off the coastline in these interesting patterns here, kind of swirling eddies. So knowing how breaking waves and currents interact and move things around can help predict where this dye will be dispersed to. You can imagine the dye might represent things like pollutants or raw sewage overflow or the larvae of some kind of coastal species. So it would be interesting to know where it's going to go as it leaves the coastline. But waves and currents can move small things like dye, but they can also move large things like people. You've probably heard of rip currents. Rip currents occur when water is funneled offshore, as shown here. And rip currents are notorious for really strong flows that have swept swimmers offshore. This infographic is released by the US Lifeguard Association, and it informs swimmers that you should try to escape a rip current by swimming parallel to shore before returning to shore so that you're not fighting the strong current. So waves and currents can also move sand around, and they can cause beach erosion. Beach erosion can happen on short time scales over the course of just a hurricane or a few days, or it can occur over longer time scales. Here is a shoreline retreat from red to yellow to green over 24 years in North Carolina. And on the right is a picture that I took in 2012 when I was doing field research in North Carolina. And I'm standing in the house that a bunch of scientists rented and looking at our neighbor house. And at high tide, the water would come up and rush underneath the house. And there were other houses on this same block that were condemned because their foundation was no longer stable due to erosion. Today, this same stretch, we were in the house right here, looks like this. Basically, it's just a row of big sandbags that stand between the houses and the ocean. It's a quick fix, it's not sustainable, but it's the best we can do for now. So what we really want to understand in order to maybe engineer better solutions is how do waves and currents work together to change things about the coastline like this? And so we really need to go back to the basics and understand how do waves go from this to this? This process, as waves approach the shoreline and transform into something that breaks, is called wave shoaling. So to explain wave shoaling, I'm going to get some help from a scenario that I think we're all very familiar with, and that's traffic in Seattle. So imagine you're on I-5 and there's no traffic, you've got lots of space, you're moving pretty quickly. Waves in deep water are just like you in your car on the road. They're moving very quickly because they have lots of water depth, and the space between the crests is relatively constant. Nobody's catching up to anybody else. However, in the traffic jam, as you approach a space that has maybe a lane cut out or an accident, all the cars slow down. This happens to waves as well. As they approach shallow water, waves begin to feel the friction of the bottom beneath them, and they slow down, and they get closer together just like these cars. Now, as the waves slow down, the waves get taller. The water has to go somewhere, and so it goes up, and then the waves get taller and steeper. Eventually, eventually the waves will break. And this is kind of like in a traffic jam, when the moment that you actually have to step on the brake, and the car stops under you, but your body keeps moving. And you kind of get that body feeling, right? And so what's happened is that the bottom of the wave is feeling the friction with the bottom, and it slows down, but the top of the wave keeps going, and it topples forward. It's not able to slow down as fast as the bottom of the wave. Let's just play that one more time. And so the wave topples forward, and that's what leads to breaking. Okay, so now the wave is breaking. How does the wave drive currents? To do that, we're going to explain this phenomenon called wave setup. So let's look at a slice of the surf zone, right where I've marked here. And in that slice, we have waves coming up towards the shore. And what you're seeing here is waves breaking from right to left as they approach the shoreline. And what wave setup is that as waves break, they are pushing water up the shoreline. But when's the last time you walked to the beach and saw like piles of water around? You don't. That's because when water is pushed uphill, it likes to flow back downhill. So the wave setup here, where water is piled up here and is higher than it is out on the shoreline, will eventually flow downhill, and that will initiate a current. So that's just one slice, but when we're looking at the surf zone, we're looking at a large expanse. And you might expect, well, you should expect, that wave breaking is not uniform everywhere. It's different in spots. And like we just talked about, wave breaking is initiated by regions of shallow water, and so you'd expect that variations in wave breaking are due to variations in the depth of the water. Here we have regions where there are lots of breaking, very little breaking, and then lots of breaking. And that leads to high setup, so a lot of water piled up on the beach, low setup, not so much, and high setup, a lot of water piled on the beach. Like I said, when you push water uphill, it wants to flow back downhill, and it'll take the path of least resistance, which causes it to flow out this way. That's one of the ways that rip currents can be generated. Okay. But waves don't always come straight onto shore like that, right? They come at an angle most of the time. And waves that come at an angle will push water in the direction that they're flowing along the coast. And this is what's called an alongshore current. So waves coming in at an angle will push water in the direction they're traveling and create this alongshore current. And here, the longest arrows here indicate the strongest part of the current, which is often observed just inside of where the waves are breaking, where the strongest forcing is happening from those waves. So let's put this all together. We have waves coming in at an angle, so we would expect it to drive an alongshore current in the direction that the waves are traveling. We have variations in the way the waves are breaking, and so we would expect water piled up, preferentially on the shore like that. But we'd also expect it to flow downhill, and so it can either contribute to the alongshore current or seek a way out through a rip current. This is a pretty comprehensive explanation of how breaking waves are responsible for driving currents in the surf zone. But this is the textbook explanation. And when you think about your beach, each beach is different, and each beach has very different waves breaking on it. So how do we take this textbook explanation and move it towards the real world? This is what my research does. So here's a beach, and with traditional measurements, we would want to measure information about these breaking waves, and we would do it by placing instruments in the water, say at these 5 points. And so divers will go out and they'll mount the scientific instrument to the bottom, and the instrument will look up through the water column, and it will measure things like wave height, wave speed, wave direction, and it'll do these with very high accuracy, great resolution, but it's only at those few points. And so if we wanted to view the entire surf zone using instruments mounted to the seafloor, it would kind of be like viewing it through a curtain of Swiss cheese. You'd get really great information in those holes, but you're missing the big picture. So what I do is I get to do both. I get to use remote sensing, and you may have heard of remote sensing in the context of satellites or in the context of NASA. Remote sensing basically means a way to measure something without touching it. So it's a way of measuring breaking waves without getting wet. And some types of remote sensing that we typically use are visible band video cameras, so that's your everyday camcorder, or cameras that are outfitted with a special lens. And my research uses an infrared camera, which has a lens that sees in the infrared waveband, which is more or less a thermal image. And so what we're seeing here is a thermal image of the surf zone. So in a thermal image, anything that's bright is relatively warmer, and anything is dark is relatively cooler. So what we're seeing is a vegetated dune here, things that are alive, plants often are very bright, and a bright horizon. And then the beach here is cool because it's saturated with water. And then that's a person walking, and that's a dog. Those appear warm, they're alive. Yeah, right? And sometimes there's surfers or birds that I see in my research data. And what you see in the ocean in general is kind of this medium darkness and kind of uniform, but breaking waves appear really bright. And so what happens is that the surface of the water is actually relatively cool. That's because of evaporation. So it's kind of like when you sweat and your sweat evaporates and it cools your body. The same thing's happening along the surface of the water. But a breaking wave disrupts that surface, and it allows the relatively warmer water below to be imaged by the infrared camera. And so that's why breaking waves, disrupting the surface, appear bright in the image. There's some more people. Okay, so how do we go from movies to real quantitative measurements about breaking waves? So we start with this same image that I just showed you. Here's the beach, and here's out in the ocean. And this is what I call the camera view. This is the perspective of the camera. Or if you were using Google Maps, this is like street view in Google Maps. So you're seeing it from the perspective of being on the ground. And then I use a little bit or a lot of high school geometry, which is useful outside of high school. And I produce the map view. Which in Google Maps would be the map view. And this is useful for finding distances, calculating actual distances and making measurements. So what I also use is a little bit of something called image analysis, which is more or less a mathy version of Photoshop. I ask the computer to identify regions of brightness or high contrast, and it pulls out the features that I want, which namely are breaking waves, and that's what's outlined in red here. And so using this map view where I can measure distances, I can measure how long the crest is or how wide the crest is. I can measure the direction the crest is traveling relative to the beach. I can measure its speed. One of those measurements I'm going to show you next, and that is the breaker width. And the reason I'm showing you that is because it's a key parameter in how I measure the force that the breaking wave exerts on the water around it. So in this video, you will see the evolution of the width of the breaker. Yellow means it's very wide, and blue means it's very narrow. So one of the awesome things about a video like this is that it's actually showing you wave by wave analysis of breaking waves. So you can track the evolution. If you look and kind of watch over time, you'll see some waves that immediately when they break, they're really bright, they're really wide, and those are really big energetic waves. And then they slowly decay down towards the blues and greens. Others, they start small. They start at the blues and greens, and then they move bigger towards the yellow, and then they decay back to the blues and greens. And so this kind of data can really help us learn about the evolution, the life cycle almost, of how waves break in the surf zone. And then using maps like this, when you build them up over time, say over 5 minutes, and use certain equations, you can estimate how much force the breaking waves are exerting on the water around them. What you see here is exactly that kind of map. So the beach is here, and the ocean's out on the right side, and this is south to north. And what we see is a region of breaking waves at the shoreline, because pretty much everything breaks at the shoreline, and then other breaking out here, further offshore. Where it's yellow, you have high forcing, and where it's dark blue, you have low forcing. So let's think about what we talked about currents and breaking waves driving currents and apply it to this image, this figure. First, we have a lot of breaking here and not so much breaking over here. So we would expect preferential piling up of water setup to occur more towards the south. And that water might try to escape towards the region where there's not as much breaking opposing the offshore flow. We can also see from these white arrows, which mark the wave direction, that the waves are kind of traveling to the north a bit, and so we'd expect an alongshore current moving to the north. So this is pretty awesome. This is this is the first time that we've been able to get two-dimensional maps of wave breaking in the surf zone based on wave-by-wave analysis of breaking. Okay, so we've got this map of wave forcing, and we've been able to guess at what the currents are, which is awesome if that's actually what the currents are doing. So now we need to figure out if we can tell what the currents are doing. Turns out remote sensing is really great for that too. What I've done in this video over here, what my advisor has done in this video over here, is it's his code from his PhD, so the code will get recycled, those PhD students in the audience, is we've asked the computer to remove the breaking waves from the image. So again, we've used some contrast processes to take away anything that's super bright, that's the breaking waves, and to just leave kind of the darkest pixels. And then we create a movie from that, and we ask the computer to track different patterns. And I would call this video very rich in patterns, which really means there's a lot of splotches and streaks, and we can track them. And so the computer can say, okay, I've got a splotch, and I see the splotch move from here to here between these two frames. I also know what the frame rate was, how much time passes in between those two frames. And so the computer can calculate its speed and the direction that it moved. Okay, so let's compare. Let's see if what we predicted here is what we actually see over here. I don't know, what do you think? I think a pretty good job. So what we've got here is current moving towards the north, and that's where the red arrows are indicated. And we also have a bit of a recirculation out here. So a longshore current moving towards the north, like we predicted, and some offshore flow out here, where there aren't breaking waves coming in and opposing that flow. This is pretty powerful stuff. So let's summarize what we talked about. First, we talked about how do waves shoal and how do they break. And then we talked about that these breaking waves actually force the motion of water in the surf zone and drive currents. And then these currents, which we talked about in kind of a textbook fashion, are much more complicated in the real world. And so we looked at ways using remote sensing where we can measure the breaking waves without getting wet, and then use those breaking waves to measure the forcing in the surf zone. And the idea being that the future applications of this are to study problems like this. So can we predict the rate of beach erosion, or is there a way to deposit sand in a region and allow the ocean's natural currents to redistribute it along the shoreline and help replenish our beaches? So all of these are definitely current research topics out there. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight, and I'd like to thank Town Hall and the Engage program. Had a ton of fun learning from them. The University of Washington, the Applied Physics Lab. My funding is from the Office of Naval Research. And over here, I just had to highlight all of the friends and teammates and family that have listened to me practice and talk about this forever. So thanks. And I would be happy to take questions.
Hey,
Hi.
great talk.
Thanks.
So you sort of mentioned that one thing that we can do is maybe predict where to put sand in, the surf zone, that it might distribute somewhere that might be convenient for us in the future. And I was just curious, how dynamic are those patterns for a given stretch of beach? Like, how quickly can it be that, sand might be deposited in one part, but then in like a year or 2 years, it might be deposited somewhere else?
Mm-hmm. So I don't have a complete answer to your question, but I do have a good case study for you to check out, and that would be the Sandmotor in the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, most of it sits below sea level, and so beach replenishment is a huge deal for them, and they have actually tried that experiment in real life. They've deposited thousands of tons of sand in one spot in this big peninsula, and then there's tons of scientists studying it to see what happens, to see how it gets redistributed. Also to see how the different animals and plants come back to that region as as it changes. So that work is being done. There's also a lot of study, especially in the Puget Sound region, about drift cells. So on the islands in the Puget Sound and things like that, there's certain regions that act kind of just within themselves. So sand tends to maybe erode from the north where the current comes in and then deposit in the south where the current dies down, depending on where you are. And so they tend to be studied and monitored and replenished just within their cell. And so from cell to cell they change. But it definitely depends on where you are. Mm-hmm.
Being a New Jersey girl yourself,
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to hear a little bit about storm impact. When you look at predicting along a shore like this and you create patterns, when a hurricane comes along, is that part of the data that gets just stronger, or does it completely disrupt what we're looking at in a pattern like that?
Mm-hmm. It intensifies everything that you see. It can lead to an extreme event of erosion. And so it not only intensifies the waves and the currents, but it can just come in and tear your beach out, and then it takes a long time for the beach to recover. One of the great things about remote sensing, though, is imagine you had your really expensive scientific instrument mounted to the sea floor and a huge storm came in and it tore apart your instrument and you lost all of your data. That is unfortunate, but with remote sensing, is an understatement. But with remote sensing, you can post this kind of camera on, say, someone's porch and look out at the surf zone and collect this data. Yes, if it's raining and it's really windy, your image quality might not be top notch, but you're able to collect data and really learn from storms in order to prepare and predict for what's going to happen next. So remote sensing is a really powerful tool for measuring in unkind conditions, let's say.
Yeah, excellent talk.
Thanks.
You're very talented. You talked a little bit about the application of this information and being able to potentially predict erosion zones. Could you also, with the knowledge of how the topography of the shores, creating these currents, strategically put things like jetties and locations to control where the waves break to control the shoreline erosion in that way?
Yes, so you can definitely, there are a couple of things. Sometimes you want to protect something against breaking waves or currents, like say a marina, and so you can put a breakwater out there and that kind of diverts the waves around. Sometimes you want to, this is a solution that turns out is actually a problem. Along the coastline where you put groins in, so that's those, what most people call jetties, rock formations that protrude out into the ocean. And what happens there is that because you again get those cells, so water comes down, sweeps, say it's coming from north to south and the jetty's going out, it'll sweep sand away from the north and it'll all get stuck down by the jetty at the south. And so you still wind up with massive erosion in these different regions and then deposition in others. So you're not really retaining it along the coast uniformly, and you create another problem for yourself that you then have to go back and correct. But it is a solution that we've tried in many places. Yeah. Thanks.